All right, it's 12 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today entitled Intersectionality and Wellness. Thank you all for taking some time to watch this. And thanks to Dr. Leese for helping facilitate and set this up. She will be monitoring the chat in case there's any questions. And of course, we are going to be recording this for folks if you want to watch this at a later date. So we're going to kind of set up the talk today through a couple of different lenses. I'm a professor here at SNU, and so I'm going to look at this from a perspective of instructing courses. So looking at it from how intersectionality interacts with wellness in the classroom from a professor's perspective as we interact with our students, but also being a psychologist, I'm particularly interested in identity for all of us. And so I hope that this will be something for all of us to kind of take some insight into in terms of how I understand my intersecting identities and how they impact kind of my overall well-being. So there's kind of multiple lenses I'm going to look at this from the perspective of kind of the academic end of things, but also from a kind of mental health and psychological perspective. So we'll start the talk off today with kind of processing how to understand intersectionality, what the word is, what it means, why it matters, of course, to you and the students that you'll instruct. And then again, the connection to health and wellness. So I'm going to kind of weave in and out of those topics as we kind of go through this. So hopefully, again, there'll be some take-home points for you from a personal level, but also kind of to inform professional development, particularly, again, how you interact and understand the students that come in and out of your class from an intersectional perspective. So what is intersectionality first? Sometimes folks aren't necessarily fully versed in terms of what that concept means. And what it means is it's a mutually constitutive relationship amongst social identities. And so this is a fancy term developed by Shields from his article that was kind of talking about intersectionality as it relates to gender. So I've pulled some of those concepts from a very specific discussion to kind of generalize it amongst kind of other concepts, other identities. So this is talking about an individual's social identities profoundly influence one's belief about an experience of any particular subject, okay? So not just gender, but sexuality, how we even interpret incoming data, how we interpret relationships in our lives, et cetera. And so why this is particularly important, I think particularly from a psychological perspective, is that psychology, frankly, has been built historically off of understanding the self and the self in isolation in a lot of ways. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest drawbacks even today of mental health, and I think kind of broad mental health publicly, socially in a lot of ways, is because we see the self as constructed of this intrapsychic process. And when I say intrapsychic, I mean kind of occurring within myself. It's my personality organization. It's my perceptions, it's my kind of burden to bear, as it were. Whereas again, kind of the intersectional perspective starts to say that, like, look, our social identities, the relationships that populate our life, our identities culturally, our identities in terms of gender and sexuality, et cetera, our religious identities, all of them influence ultimately not only kind of how I see myself, but how I interpret a myriad of information. Okay, so as a result, my individual social location needs to be at the forefront of understanding of self, understanding of how I interpret information and how I relate to other people. So that's part of the goal of this talk today, is to kind of broaden the perspective of, I would say, well-being, but also, again, as I think of myself as an instructor in that identity, how to start to remember that the information that I take in and the information that I share with folks is going out to a myriad of folks that have a variety of social locations and identities that are going to influence the way in which they interpret me and the way that they interpret the information that I'm sharing. So this theory, intersectionality, is kind of built off of the concepts of feminist theory. So this is, again, a psychological theory. There's all sorts of theories that exist in psychology. Some of you may be familiar with Sigmund Freud. He developed psychoanalysis. So all sorts of different like theoretical ideas that exist out there. Feminist theory is more of a kind of what I would consider a postmodern approach that's come along over the last 20-ish years or so. Nowadays, it is called, referred to a little bit more like relational cultural theory. I referenced there Fry's article on relational cultural theory in 2013. She was actually my supervisor, my advisor at OU during my doctorate program. And so I've been trained in this theory. This is the primary theory that I practiced out of as a doctoral student. So pretty familiar with the concept of it. And basically what, again, it talks about is that we are doing ourselves and the people that we service, whether as a professor or as a clinician, a disservice if we only try to understand them from an intrapsychic perspective. We've got to understand the influence of context, the influence of broader socio-political entities that influence not only why I see myself the way that I do, but particularly maybe even the distress that I feel as a result. And so it talks about, N's article in 2004 says that, again, it's impossible to be value-free. We all have our value systems. And those values that we carry with us are going to impact, again, how we interpret information and how we interact with other people in our lives. So it's important, this is why I love psychology and therapy, is it's critically important to understand what my value system is, right? And not only what it is, but what are the multiple layers, the intersecting pieces that ultimately inform why I interpret information the way that I do. So the translation to this is that we have lenses through which we present information as instructors, ways that we see ourselves, the ways that we see other people in our life. And this is constructed not just by this kind of magical personality organization that I can't see inside of my head, but it's constructed considerably by the social identity that I carry with me as well, as much as it is my kind of inherent personality. So I'm going to share a little bit first about my identity package, not as a way just to kind of make this about me, but I'll kind of talk about how this is pretty critical to, I think, again, developing yourself in a healthy, well perspective is to be able to kind of understand the different layers that make us tick. And so as a professor, I like to do this as a modeling process. I am not terribly comfortable talking about myself. Anybody that knows me knows that I tend to keep to myself quite a bit, and I'll talk about partially why that is. So for me, this is not necessarily fun, and it's actually fairly vulnerable, but I think it's actually a really good model in a lot of ways as a professor and as a human being to be able to kind of, again, normalize kind of who you are. So I had to conduct an identity package as a part of my doctoral program. This was in my second practicum course. And it was fascinating to me because obviously, as you can see, I'm a white male. I was raised in a Nazarene circle. So come from as those of you that are Nazarene understand what that might indicate and entail. And I was asked to reflect on my cultural identity as I developed an identity package. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't know how to do that, right? And I see this a lot as a professor with our master's students. We ask them in their kind of their capstone projects, they have to do a workup of a client that they see on their internship. And we have them write a pretty thorough multicultural section. And it's always been fascinating to us that that section is written strangely if the client happens to be white, because the students have a tendency to kind of go like, well, they don't have any multicultural factors, they're white. And I found myself in that same situation as going, what do you mean my cultural identity? I'm white. I feel like I'm almost acultural. And so what I learned about that is it was a fascinating developmental process to where I started to learn that that is a very privileged perspective to get to come from, right? That I haven't had to think about what my cultural identity is. I just go in with a majority mindset in a lot of ways, assuming that everyone else has the same experiences and sees things the way that I do because I'm from the dominant culture. And so again, I highlight the word privileged here, and that was one of the biggest takeaways for me, is that I've actually had the privilege of not having to necessarily think about what my racial or gender identity does in terms of affecting my life. I don't have to have an answer to that because I've never had to really think about it. And again, why I think this is critically important as a therapist, as a human being, as a professor, is because that is obviously not the case for lots of other folks. And the fact that I haven't had to think about that is actually where privilege comes in, okay? I've historically been able to walk into situations and assume that whatever my performance, whether it's my CV or et cetera, whatever that is all that matters. My identity isn't necessarily a factor in this. And again, that is a privileged perspective to have that a lot of folks actually do not share. And so for me, like what I had to learn is it was interesting because that invokes a defensive process, of course, right? Like you just want to, and I share this to say that like I when I applied to doctoral programs, there was one in particular that they had called me and said, we can't let you in. You're obviously qualified, but you're a white male and we're going to wait until everyone else gets a chance before we will offer you a spot. And I remember being very defensive about that and going like, that is discrimination, right? That's not fair. And it was really one of the first times that I had to think about like my gender identity, right? My racial identity and how that potentially impacts kind of my performance. And they were basically kind of saying to me, your CV is good, but who you are, we need more folks that don't look like you. And again, what that invokes a lot of times from people, and we see this culturally now in particular, is a lot of defensive processes. And so my hope is that when you listen to this and you even reflect on your own identities, that you try to remember that defensiveness is probably an initial reaction that we all have, but try to think beyond that, think creatively, think widely about that, and don't let that be where the conversation stops, okay? Because for me, what it helped with was start to go like, no, that's absolutely true. Historically, I've been able to walk into a situation where I haven't had to think about this. And in fact, me being a white male often opened the door much wider than other people did, than other people had the chance to. So again, many of our students, if I were to ask you what your intersecting identities are, you're not going to have the privilege necessarily of being able to say, never thought about that before. You know very well what that is. You know very well what those identities are. And you know very well also that your CV isn't necessarily the first thing that gets evaluated. It's ultimately a lot of times your gender, your racial identity, all sorts of other different factors that influence kind of why people evaluate you the way that you do. So why does this matter? To me, what this means is ultimately that starting points look very different for many different people, okay? When you have the privileges of not thinking about some of these factors, you are at a different starting point than other people are. So as a professor, why does this matter? I think it matters to me in terms of when I am interpreting and presenting what I think is just facts, right? So we have this theorist that's been a long-standing psychologist that like we read every year and have read for 10 years in our program, that is an incredible writer, very skilled and very influential psychologist that, you know, it's been interesting. Before I went through my doctoral program, I just was kind of reverent to his writing. I really felt like that what he presented was factual truth. But when you start to evaluate it through different lenses, through different lenses of privilege and culture, you start to see the problems in it. And what I've had to come around with over the years is to recognize that it doesn't mean we throw out what he has to say. He writes a chapter in particular in one of his case books. He writes about cases that he's worked. One of those chapters is really offensive if you actually read it. And I've had students that have reacted who share similar identities to the patient in this case from a perspective of feeling very offended by the writing. Now, part of what we work on is to start to recognize why it's triggering the things that it is in us. And I think the mistake we make sometimes is we think, well, we have to throw that out then. Like because he's written a very problematic chapter, we shouldn't read any of his stuff. But part of what we've had to do is look at it and go, he's actually not writing this from a place of saying, look at how good I am. He's writing it from the perspective of this is a weak moment in me. This is actually me being biased. This is actually me thinking of people in very problematic terms. And he's being very vulnerable about that. So the beauty of it is that we're all capable of that and do that type of stuff all the time. I always tell students that if we had to write a chapter of our least kind of like shining moment, as it were, if we're going to use a March Madness term here for a second, if we were to write something of those chapters that we had other people read, it would not be pleasant, right? It wouldn't be fun. And we would hope for some grace too. So I think the point in this is that what we've got to be able to do is recognize that data is interpreted in a myriad of ways, and it is socially constructed in terms of how I see information, and other people are simply not going to see it that way. And I think that the key then is a conversation, being able to have conversations about how have you interpreted this from your particular identity? What does that lead you to feel? How has that then led me to miss particular perspectives? And again, I think we're better as we participate in this together with one another, okay? So in my back to my identity package, when I had to actually sit back and think about it, it was quite helpful in a lot of ways. Again, I recognized the external things, like that I'm male, that I'm white, religious, I'm Nazarene by nature, but I also had to dig into some other identities that informed part of who I am that I think impact me even to this day, right? I had a relational family system that was secure, loving parents, but the attachment was what I would call a touch distant at times, right? Relationality was something that was in some ways surface level. And it's an idea that as a clinician I love, but I really struggle to embrace it. So a lot of times what I do with relationality is I make it a cognitive exercise, right? So like I'm good at doing these presentations, I think, in terms of like presenting people information, but connection in kind of the embodied way is really difficult for me. I keep to myself a lot, right? So for me, life has been about solo, internal focused things. My canvas is an imaginative process. And so my coping mechanism, what I had to learn in this is of effort, okay? And so this has been very important to me, and I hope you see that intersectionality is not simply just what race am I, what gender am I, what socioeconomic status am I, but it also requires those deeper dives too, in terms of what if my family system helped me see the world as? How do I take that information? What is the value systems that I propagate? And what are the coping mechanisms that I use that, again, have good and bad sides to them? The thing I work on with people all the time as a therapist is that the things that make you great are the things that make you crazy sometimes, right? My effort in that coping mechanism of putting forth effort into everything helps me accomplish a lot during the day, but it's exhausting from a perspective of just mental health. I've even found myself today going, I need this week to end already. I am exhausted, okay? And some of that isn't necessarily that the week needs to end, it's that I probably need to try to do things differently in terms of how I engage my week, right? So why am I telling you all of this? Again, I think the point here is if we think about wellness, right? Our identities work together to inform how, again, we interpret lots of information, okay? How do I see myself? I see myself as someone who must perform. That is a male idea. That is also an idea that is very Western and individualized. It is also something that's been a byproduct of my kind of semi-relational attachment system that has meant that we're around each other, but we're kind of on our own too. And so all of those identities work together to inform this kind of need to be productive, okay? So I hope what you hear in this is not just that you learn something about me, but I hope you're starting to ask questions of yourself about what are my identity pieces, right? What are the things that kind of work together to inform how I see who I am? And what are the downsides of that? There's, again, it's not good versus bad. It's just what are the sides of that that potentially work against me? And then also it's important to recognize how that lens affects how I interpret other people, okay? How I interpret incoming written information, what I'm bound to pay attention to and what I'm bound to ignore. And then also, how do I handle uncertainty, okay? So the moral of my story is simply that I've learned I rely on myself, I work hard, and I expect others to do the same. And when I'm faced with uncertainty, effort is the way out of this, okay? You notice my last bullet point says that that's a bit of an insecure process in a lot of ways, and I think that's true, right? It's very self-involved, right? And it is very much believing this idea that like I am a product of what I can produce. And again, that is very tenuous places to be in your life, right? It is going to cause you to constantly feel like I'm only a product of what I do. And how does that affect me relationally? Well, imagine as a father, right? I'm going to have a tendency to want to look at my children through that same lens also. And I've got to be careful of that. I'm going to want to look at my students through that lens as well, right? Is if they're not performing, I am going to have a tendency to look at them and just judge them in a negative fashion, instead of being able to kind of interpret that what are the intersecting identities that are leading them to maybe struggle to perform, right? So again, I hope what you're hearing in this is that as I said at the beginning of this talk, I want to approach this from multiple perspectives. I hope you take some information out of this to look at yourself a little differently, hopefully with some grace, but also to look at like how this impacts your identities as professors, right? How do I deliver information? How do I maybe miss the opportunities to have conversations with my students who have different types of identities as well, and how they might be interpreting the information that I'm coming in, and maybe starting to recognize that postmodern idea that there is no such thing as fact, right? It's all socially constructed information, okay? And that's something we don't like to think about, because again, we love certainty as human beings, okay? So again, I talk a little bit more about this. I've kind of hit a lot of this, but like, I believe from a cognitive perspective that relationships are how to solve ambiguity and how to best cope. But I am determined to make that a part of my therapy work, so it becomes a very, like, again, work thing for me. So my tendencies, again, to evaluate other people become a very, like, what I would say, male, Western identified hierarchical process, rather than being a relational one, even though from a cognitive perspective, I know that that's the answer. So my style, in a lot of ways, I notice this as a supervisor of clinicians. I tend to be educational and lecturing, right? And that is problematic, because what I think it develops in my supervisees unintentionally is a tendency to be dependent on me. And what I've learned very early on as a clinician, as a trainer of therapists, is that you can't be totally reliant on the therapist, right? Like, if you need me in your life to function as a therapist, then I'm doing something wrong. My goal should be to empower you. And so what I mean by this is that ultimately my style, all of these identities that I've illuminated, create a person that is capable of working with knowledge, but that's going to be his go-to. And so I'm going to tell my supervisees, and potentially want to tell my clients, here's what you need to do. Here's how to understand this. And that isn't always helpful, particularly if you consider what identities they're coming into the room with as well. They might easily give power over, particularly to a male, and that is going to ultimately continue a cycle of problems in their own life that are actually the core of what's bringing them to therapy in the first place. So hopefully that makes sense, that like what I'm talking about here is that not understanding our identities, right, is potentially problematic and creates systems of what I would say oppression with the folks that we come into contact with in our day-to-day lives, okay? So this identity that I'm kind of talking about, I've kind of already alluded to, of me being a little bit more of an information presenter and a lecturer. How might that feel to students that are in my classroom, or supervisees that I work with, who maybe struggle with this approach, who have had very domineering presences in their life, who've told them what to do? They're going to probably, again, relive those experiences. So all that to say, what I hope you can start to reflect on is, what's your story? And how does your story, in terms of your differing identities, differ and thus change how you interpret data in good and bad ways, right? Again, I think there's a lot of contribution that each of our perspectives has on how we interpret information, but I think there's also limitations to that as well. So the point in understanding of the socially constructed self, again, is not to promote shame. I think that, you know, in the efforts to promote any idea, I've learned this in theories of psychology, is I'm trying to promote an idea, I have a tendency to do it so vociferously that I end up cornering and basically shoving half of the conversation away, right? Like I end up creating, or unintentionally creating, a shame process in people. And I don't think that that's what any of these conversations are meant to have. I think this is why we see what we see going on with CRT in the, you know, the broader lexicon of conversation these days, right? Is it's become very bifurcated. You're either for it or you're against it. And it's like, this isn't really anything to be for or against. It's just conversations, right? Recognizing that, again, we have different starting points, we have different lenses. And so how do we start to look at information from broader lenses? How do we invite more conversation about how other people might look at information differently than we do? And for whatever reason, like because we're feeling defensive, people are protecting against those concepts, and that's unfortunate, right? So again, this isn't good or bad. It is tendencies, it's identities, okay? So I want to talk a little bit then about some psychology, simply because I think this is helpful to understand how the brain works and why I think we hunker down in ways that we do and don't invite this kind of nuance and broad perspective on self and others. So I hope that this is helpful in just kind of, again, taking a little bit of a psychological lens and look at this. So I want to talk a little bit about how, the psychology of the brain is set up to where a lot of things are automatic, okay? And so our brains are trying to categorize a lot of times for the sake of simplicity. We want to put things into categories and we want to kind of make sense of them because, again, that's in a lot of ways helpful for us. I always tell my students, if I had to think about everything that I did, if I had to think about that I need to grab this controller and I need to hold my fingers around it, I wouldn't get anything done. So the majority of what happens in the brain, we've learned this psychologically, is automatic. It's called the concept of automaticity, and it happens outside of our awareness. So my practice of therapy and my practice of psychology is heavily focused not on what you tell me about yourself, but what you're going to do. So I talk about this in my psych assessment stuff. I have people do self-reports all the time to tell me what they think's going on, and that's valuable information, but it's incomplete. So I often do a lot of testing on what you're going to do, particularly when you're faced with ambiguity, because your brain is going to try to categorize things. And I think ultimately, again, what this leads to then is recognizing that every person is different and we cannot understand people universally. Context is critically important to understanding who individuals are. And this is, again, has been the weakness, I would say, of psychology over the years. It's been very individualized. And even today, psychologists and therapists are trying to create therapy treatments and even theories that say, like, here's what this person with this particular diagnostic cluster does. And the truth is I can tell you from experience, even two different people who have the diagnosis of depression, it looks different from one person to the next. And I like this concept that distress manifests as the response, not just to my intrapsychic structure, so not just to my mental health, but distress ultimately manifests as a response to systems. So I think, again, the biggest weakness in psychology historically has been we've seen individuals as just individuals. We haven't looked at them as a product of systems. And I mean this in terms of family systems, but also cultural systems and broader socio-political systems, right? And so what this means is that we're all a part of these systems, and those systems very much influence why I see things the way that I do and why I ignore other perspectives. So this article, this statement, or this particular quote here at the top comes from an advisor that I had as a doctoral student. And she talked about how psychiatric symptoms come forth for individuals as they attempt to cope with stress related to oppression, trauma, and sociocultural identities. And so this is, again, a very postmodern feminist approach that talks about that, like, individual suffering is not just a product of me, it's a product of us, right? It's a product of potential oppression. It's a product of the socio-culturally constructed identities that I have, etc. And this again gets into kind of this, what I call postmodern idea that language is not just a reflection of our deepest structural feelings, but it's socially constructed. Basically this, that we've agreed, not always consciously, but we've kind of socially constructed ideas about what certain terms mean, right? So I use anxiety. We've all agreed as to what anxiety is supposed to look like. And so we then pathologize that, right? Well, if you've ever heard any of my lectures on anxiety, I talk about that anxiety is actually a normal process. It's a normal brain function. And it becomes pathological in a lot of ways by how we interpret the anxiety. It's that we're trying to get rid of it. We're seeing it as a weakness and a bad thing, when in fact, it's been a survival mechanism for our brains. Like, that is actually something our bodies use. But it's about the meaning then that I assign to fill in the blank, in this example, anxiety, that causes the problem. So the point here is that if we're going to understand somebody, we got to understand the meaning that they're giving to events. And the meaning we give to events is, again, a product of intersectionality. It's a product of the identities that I have been raised in, right? That I have been around. And so psychology, for a lot of the psychology that we see today, has been shaped by a Western Americanized perspective that is very individual by nature. And it does not do a good job of representing multiple intersecting identities and perspectives. And so the summary and goal of this, and I put this in an educational perspective for a second, okay? Again, as I said, one of my identities is a professor. So I try to think about this not only therapeutically, but how do I see this in terms of how I participate in the education process with my students. So what I want to understand, I think, with my students and with myself is what categories or what is their brains trying to do with this information? What identities do they have that when I present something that I believe is universal is going to be looked at differently from all the different perspectives in the room? And so I want to ask the question of my students, I think, from time to time, of what categories is your brain trying to put the information that I'm presenting to you into, okay? And how does your context influence that perspective? And how do we start to see struggle, right? Whether it's academic struggle, mental health struggle, general life struggle as an us issue rather than a you issue, right? Recognizing that, again, our categories that we've created as human beings are socially constructed and thus not universal. So everybody has a narration, everybody has a meaning that is important to understand. And thus empowerment, I think in a lot of ways, should be the goal of education. I hope it's the goal of therapy. And I think in order for it to be, I have to understand my lenses, right? I have to understand how my identities inform helping people. I have a tendency, I've always said, to be the knight in shining armor here, that kind of swoops into the room and rescues people. That's very emasculating in a lot of ways to people. It's very demeaning in a lot of ways to people. They don't need the white male to come in and rescue them. They need someone to partner with and maybe even to take a step behind to be able to empower them to get to where that they need to go. I also looked at this from an S&U issue as well. If I see this from, again, I can't help but, again, think systemically that my identity is a part of an S&U identity. And so what do I think this means then for what we're doing as a broader community? If we understand intersectionality and wellness in these ways, I would look at it from the perspective of how do we as a collective brain, and I mean that to say, how do we as S&U try to put incoming social information into context, right, into particular categories, right? And how does our context of being Nazarene, largely white, influence our perspectives on different social issues? It's something very near to my heart as a therapist, that there's all sorts of identity issues. There's all sorts of what I would say hot button issues in our society these days that we as a collective brain of S&U are going to try to put into categories, right? And I want us to start to kind of challenge kind of how we see that we have created this unconscious language system that is potentially limiting, right? And begins to kind of like, I would say, outgroup and categorize people in potentially problematic ways. And I think part of how we change that is start to see, again, the concept that distress, struggle is an us issue. It's not an issue necessarily of badness and sin and others. It's a symptom of us together, right? We are all in this distress. We are all in this struggle together. And so what would that mean then to cultivate character and create a culturally responsive community and reflect Christ, which is our mantra, right? Character, culture, Christ here at S&U. How would that look if we started to reinterpret the way in which we categorize issues, right? And how do we then use that to create conversation and empower the next generation of students that continues to come in, okay? So I want to talk about this then as we kind of shift into the kind of last part of the discussion today, from the processes of like how I see change happening through a couple of what I would say very important intersectional lenses. And I'm going to look at this from how I see change happening in therapy, how I think it happens then in the classroom, and I hope they kind of mesh together in a helpful way. But I always talk about in therapy that it's the process. You can see this quote from Wachtel in 2008. And what Wachtel kind of talks about that I very much resonate with, that There is no magic moment in therapy that makes the change. It's not about information that I give to someone. It's not about this aha moment that necessarily clicks. I always tell people that I don't remember exactly what it was when I was in my therapy work as a client that made the difference. I don't remember something my therapist said that said, no, that was the thing that captured it and caught me and turned the tide. It was the process of engaging with someone who was there with me, that collaborated. I knew he was going to show up and I knew he was engaged. And that's really all I needed, right? And so to me, change is the practice of engaging, right? And that means conversations. That means engaging things that make us uncomfortable, looking at our lenses and starting to recognize that I have a limited lens. Not that it's necessarily bad, it just is limited. And so starting to have conversations around multiple perspectives is actually a sign of health, right? It's actually a sign of psychological creativity, which creativity has actually been found to be one of the biggest elements to wellness and well-being. In the classroom, I think, again, this is a big lesson about showing up and engaging, creating environments as professors in which we explore and interact and ask questions about uncertainty instead of defending against it, which is what, again, our brains want to do because they don't know what to do with the information. They want to jam it into a category. We want to start to, again, promote uncertainty maybe a little bit, right? To promote not always having the answers. I think there's strength in that. And this is where I think postmodern theories, intersectionality, bring to the table and are battled against so much. Because again, human beings by nature are terrified of uncertainty. They don't like ambiguity. And so intersectionality and postmodern thought challenges that there isn't a structure to understand, that there's multiple ways to look at a particular situation, and that is terrifying to the human brain. And so we push it away, we defend against it, we lock down. And that is the biggest sign of psychological unwellness, I would argue. I also talk about in therapy that a lot of times it's having a conversation about the conversation. So it's not just talking about particular topics, but it's talking about us talking about the conversation, right? The topic. And so I noticed you responded this way to when I said things. And to me, this is very much a postmodern feminist relational cultural idea, is that sometimes with clients, I have to talk about, what is it like to be in the room with a white male? What is it like to have me potentially be in a situation of having the power in the room and trying to help you? What are your experiences with that before? And what is that potentially causing me to miss in the therapeutic environment? Not because I'm necessarily not trained or because I'm wrong or you're wrong, but because we're all limited based off of our perspectives, okay? Our brains want to predict the future, and they're going to use previous experiences to do so. So how do we start to change the conversation, start to talk about that process of what we're engaging in? And again, I think in the classroom, this relates to owning our experiences, recognizing that this is the information, and I tend to kind of lean towards it because of my experiences and my identities, but you all may not see this the same way. And I want to have conversations about that. I call this in therapy the working alliance. And I say you're developing that with your students as you invite them into the uncertainty and create a space that is genuine and accepting. Now, remember, I talked about at the beginning of this talk that I wanted this to be not just about you as a professor in that identity role. I also want to talk about that from you as an individual, as a human being, right? And so I hope when you see that when I say the word space, creating space that's genuine and accepting in the classroom, I would say that that is a prerequisite for you as an individual as well. I hope what we can all do is create space in ourselves for genuineness and acceptance of who we are. One of my biggest things that I enjoy working with therapeutically is learning to accept. And that doesn't mean accept in the way that we've constructed that concept. That doesn't mean like, well, it's just the way that I am. That means having compassion towards the self, recognizing that I, as a human being, am wired to be anxious by nature. And so anxiety is always a constant companion, but that doesn't mean that I have to be identified as simply anxious. It just means that it's a part of who I am, and I'm going to accept that and change the things that I can and accept the things that I can't, okay? So just a couple of mindfulness factors as we start to kind of head towards wrapping this up that I think are critically important. To me, this is important as a professor, it's important as a human being, particularly it's important with my identities of being a white male. I think the thing that I've had to continue to recognize is that there is a power differential in the room. This is certainly true as the professor, right? You have a privileged position, you have some power in the room. And so this is true of me as a supervisor, it's true of me as a clinic director, but it's also true just because, again, historically, white males have been the power brokers in our society. It's a lot of unearned privilege, of course, but there's an identity that goes with that. And what I have to be mindful of is how to work through that in a mindful way with people to, what I would argue, work towards equilibrium. And I think equilibrium occurs through what Archinsky talks about here as critical reflexivity. It's being able to look at the self and being able to look at the self in very honest and open ways to be able to go, like, again, with my identity package, I haven't had to think about my cultural identity, my gender identity. I've been able to just walk into a room. That's a privileged perspective that a lot of people do not share. And that unfortunately creates a strong potential for bias that I have. And so again, I think what that looks like is just having a humble perspective on who I am, how I perceive information, what my perceptions are limited, not because I'm weak, not because I'm bad, not because I'm unintelligent, but because I'm engaging in a brain process of categorization. And I have identities that limit my perspective. So we hope, what I hope this, potentially can create is a non-reactive process, because again, like, reactivity is a sign of weakness in a lot of ways. And us being able to look at things and let's have conversation and let's start to kind of, again, own our stuff, I think is a very strong sign of mental well-being. And it's recognizing my place of privilege, that it was an unearned privilege in a lot of ways, even if I've worked hard to get where I'm at. There's lots of people that have worked hard that don't get the privilege of being in the position I am. I actually talked to one of my supervisees about this yesterday, that I just happened to be lucky to get into the position that I am. Did I work hard? Sure, but so did he. And he ended up in a position where he wasn't as lucky. And it has nothing to do with me being better. It has to do with random situations, potentially different aspects of things, and probably different identities that I share that made it easier for me than it did for other folks. Now, again, what does this mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take a step away, but I do think that you have to be mindful as someone who might occupy a power position, to allow others to take those spaces that you are drawn to occupy and maybe even feel privileged to occupy or should occupy, that maybe other people should get the opportunities to occupy those roles instead. And I think when you're able to recognize that your status, your identity has played a role in where you're at, you're able to do that from a less defended perspective. And I think the other mindfulness factor relates again to awareness, that context is critically important. I say this in my psychological assessment. I see a lot of psychologists that do interviews with people, but they don't seem to take in the information of the context of the person's life when they're interpreting the data. So it becomes a very data heavy process. And the problem is data can look the same from one person to the next, but mean very different things based off of their lived experiences, okay? So the point here is that I disclosed about myself earlier, not to, again, feel good about myself or to fill the time, but I hoped what it modeled was a little bit of self-disclosure and transparency. Because again, the attempt here is to, in some ways, kind of, again, own my stuff, but create equilibrium. And it goes to this quote that I really love of Bernard and Goodyear's, that talks about the goal in therapy, the goal as being a professor, the goal in anything in life is to develop power with, not power over. And I think that is incredibly important. And it's an incredibly difficult line to walk, depending on your historical identities, your family systems, your cultural systems. Those can be really difficult places to occupy at times. And that equilibrium can be very difficult to obtain. But I think it requires deeper looks into who we are. This is why intersectionality to me is so critical. Who I am on multiple levels, why I organize information the way that I do. I think ultimately what that creates is what I would consider existential freedom. I'm a big existentialist in terms of thought. And I believe that, like, again, we're restricted and constricted in certain ways, but human beings were meant to be free. And I don't mean that in the Americanized sense of free. I mean that in freedom of knowledge of self. That ultimately it's what I would say an us process. It's a collectivist process rather than it is an independent process, right? The development of healthy selves, development of you as a healthy self, development of your classroom, your students as a healthy self is had through relationship versus individuation and autonomy. So the goal is ultimately to have a healthy felt sense of self rather than a myth of myself as a separate entity. And again, I think that goes against the Western idea of kind of I am my own entity. I must pick myself up by my bootstraps, etc. I must create my own future. I think what relational cultural intersectionality brings to the table is we need to have again, what I like Fry says here, a felt sense of self rather than this linear, simplistic perspective. And that requires then that systems have to be consistently evaluated. The S&U system, my personal system, the systems that I'm a part of, need to continually be challenged, nuanced, potentially changed, rather than expecting other people to adjust to our systems. So again, that requires that critical reflexivity, right? How does my identity, my social identity, impact the ways in which I perpetuate cycles that are rigid and problematic and even oppressive, okay? And so there's power, I would ultimately say, in self-understanding and recognizing how this self-understanding and kind of the identities that have kind of been created in me cause me to miss particular information. So again, the last couple of questions are really just kind of, I hope, self-reflective for you all, is not only kind of what environments do you create for your students and professors, but what kind of home and base, what kind of home environment do you create for yourself based off of your intersecting identities? What's good about those? What are limited about those? How does understanding those different factors that influence who I am change my perspective on who I am and maybe on how I see other people? And maybe starting to recognize that, again, that like we're in this together. I use the word pathology, that's a strong term, but I mean it in the ways that like my distress, my struggles, my pathology is not just mine, it's ours together, right? And I think if we started to look at that collectively, particularly here at SMU, I think it would change the way that we invited other people in to our environment, to our community. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my presentation